Well, this is last week. I couldn't come because of the, because of health issues with a family member. But we were actually looking, Josh and I were looking in the back at some of, and if anyone hasn't had a chance to look at the back, there's a lot of different pamphlets and books that talk about the worldwide struggle against imperialism. There's books from that have speeches and writings of Amilcar Cabral from Guinea-Bissau. We found some books from Ho Chi Minh, Kim Il-sung. There's a lot of wealth of materials back there. But there's also a book about that was put out by YAF, and YAF, which is was Youth Against War and Fascism, was in the 60s and 70s. It was the youth and student organization of the Workers' World Party. And just to give an indication of how effective it was, YAF called for and pulled off the first demonstration against the Vietnam War. This was back when it wasn't officially. The Vietnam conflict was never officially called a war. It was referred to as a conflict, but it was a war. The Vietnamese people, it was a war. The imperialists may call it a conflict, but to the people who were being massacred and slaughtered, it's a war. Just as our daily lives, a war is being waged against us, whether we call it that or not. It is what it is. But Ho Chi Minh, who was the revolutionary leader of the Vietnamese resistance struggle, also a communist, who fought against the Japanese in World War II, fought against the French, before World War II, before Japan came and replaced the French forces in Vietnam, and also fought against the U.S. after 1954, after the French were defeated and kicked out. He, in an interview, acknowledged that YAF had called for this demonstration. And Ho Chi Minh, he was born actually on the same date as Malcolm X. Not the same year, but the same day. They share a birthday. And he wrote, like years ago, I think it was like 1911, or sometime after that, he wrote about the conditions that black people were facing in the South and the lynchings that were going on. And he talked about the importance of, people understanding the hypocrisy of the United States when people were being lynched in the South. During that time, a lot of historians will say that, maybe as little as 1,000 people were being lynched or disappearing a year. We hear about people disappearing in other countries, but we don't know that. There are still people who disappear, especially undocumented migrant workers, primarily from Mexico, who are coming home, really, when it's the Southwest. I lived in Colorado before I moved to Jersey City, which is where I live now, and the great majority of Colorado was Mexico. So was Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, California. That was all Mexico. And so people in Texas, people just coming home, really, because it's their historical home. And Mexican people have a right to it, to reclaim it. But back during the early part of the 20th century, there were a lot of black people being disappeared and lynched, and it continues to this day to a certain extent, but not at the same level. But the reason why I bring that up is that there's been a long history and tradition of struggle, Workers' World and youth that have been associated with the Workers' World Party, which FIST is. Not everybody in FIST is a member of the Workers' World Party, but we are associated with the Workers' World Party and take our political line from the Workers' World Party. So we are part of that long history and tradition of struggle. Such as we, currently FIST has really only been around for about 5 years, even though some of the people who are in FIST now had been around Workers' World Party for a number of years before. I didn't come around in 2004 myself. And since then, we've engaged in a number of different struggles. But, I think that when you talk about the current stage of U.S. imperialism around the world and what's happening with the capitalist ruling class in this country, you can see, and you could see years ago, when I first came to Detroit was in the 80s, because my mother grew up between here and Laurel, Mississippi, and her grandparents lived here, and I remember coming here, and I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, which is a factory city itself, much smaller, but has a lot of this. It's a smaller version of Detroit in some ways, but doesn't have it's not as densely populated by black people. Black people make up about 20%. But I remember, and this was, you know, when things were really beginning to get bad, when massive layoffs had, you know, begun happening. But there were still a lot of jobs in the factories here. But what's happened here, what's happened in Detroit, what has happened, and what's currently happening here, gives an indication of the stage that we're in capitalism, and that's just that most of the jobs that have disappeared, either they have disappeared because of the technological revolution that has happened in the last 20 or so years, or they have been packed up, factories and the equipment in factories packed up and shipped somewhere else where people can be super exploited. And so that gives the capitalists, they can make a higher rate of profit when they pay the workers less, because people had, through struggle, militant struggle, workers had won a lot of concessions from the bosses here. But this has happened all across the country in the so-called, what they call the Rust Belt, and it's happening at even greater breakneck speed right now. And the thing is, those jobs aren't going to return. They're not coming back. Yeah. Maybe a year from now, they can say, well, the unemployment rate is 7%, but that won't really reflect what the real unemployment rate is. At a certain point, people stop being counted as being unemployed. There are some people who may be in their 20s and never had a job, never had an opportunity to get a job, so they've never been counted as being unemployed. A lot of these people are people of color, black and Latino and indigenous. And when we talk about indigenous, you go on the reservations, you're talking about 50 to 80% unemployment, and dire poverty that you sometimes you'll step onto a reservation, you might think you just stepped into a whole other country because the conditions are so bad on the reservations. So all that basically, you know, I say all that because the reason why I'm saying all that is that having a fifth chapter here in Detroit and being able to carry out militant actions here in Detroit and relate to the community in Detroit and be part of the struggle here in Detroit is very important. I think when people see struggle happen in Detroit, it gives a sense of the political consciousness of people around the country. Because this, people say it all the time, and you can never say it enough really, but this is ground zero for what's happening in this country. This is ground zero for deindustrialization. This is ground zero for just the casting off of workers into basically oblivion, because when no one's counting you anymore, that's where you exist, in oblivion. No one's looking at you, you're invisible. I get a chance to travel quite a bit, you know, to work on various different actions and organizing campaigns. And one of the places that I'm relating to now is in Pittsburgh, because the G20 is going in Pittsburgh. And you know, when Obama went to Pittsburgh, President Obama went to Pittsburgh during his election campaign, you know, Pittsburgh was presented as this place that had so many green jobs and it's responsible development. You go downtown and you see where the Allegheny and the Monongahela meet, you know, and it turns into the Ohio River, and it's been, you know, it's been sort of beautified, and you might think aesthetically it looks different than it would have looked 20 some years ago, because Pittsburgh used to be one of the most polluted cities in the country, because you had the steel plants. You know, they were in like Homestead, Alkeepa, they were in Pittsburgh and the surrounding areas, and you know, it created a lot of smog, and the rivers were polluted. But that's not because of the process of steel necessarily, it's just because of the way that capitalism works. The capitalist class cares nothing about the environment, and they care nothing about cleaning up the plants. So when the process, you know, now they say it's, I guess Forbes magazine listed Pittsburgh as like the 10th cleanest city in the country, or in the top 10 of clean cities in the country, which, you know, says a lot, especially for oppressed people who were breathing that stuff in every day, and their children had higher rates of asthma or other respiratory illnesses. But when you go to the outer line, when you go from downtown,